Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who's starting to join us. Happy Earth Week. We are going to start in just a minute. Okay. Welcome, everyone. This is our Earth Day dialogue. Heavy metals in our food, understanding risks and moving towards solutions. Okay, it's 9:01. We'll get started. Hi, I'm Angela Bernhardt. I head up communications for Pure Earth. Welcome, and thanks for joining us to mark Earth Day. We have a great speaker lineup. Just a couple housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and we'll be sending the link to everyone after. And after the speakers, we'll be taking your questions. So as people are speaking, just go ahead and put your questions into the Q&A chat box. And so we're very pleased this morning to have Leslie Norton as our moderator. Leslie's the editorial director for sustainability at Morningstar. Morningstar is a widely read investment site for individual investors and the advisors who serve them. So you can check out Leslie's terrific articles on sustainability and ESG. Her Twitter handle is @LeslieNorton@NYC. And over to you, Leslie.
Thank you, Angela. Happy Earth Day, everyone. Thank you to Pure Earth for inviting me to moderate and to dig deeper into this issue that's usually not explored as part of Earth Day, but it touches all our lives. The fact is that pollution knows no borders, and one of the routes that it travels is through our food system. We have 4 speakers today who will help us explore and understand different facets of this issue, about the solutions that are being worked on, and what we all can do individually to reduce our risk and protect the most vulnerable among us, the infants, toddlers, and pregnant women. Joining us are Drew MacArthur, Dr. Paramita Hore, Dr. James Rogers, and Dr. Stefan Berzer O'Reilly. I'm going to give more detailed descriptions of these fine folks later on. So Drew MacArthur is executive director at Pure Earth, and Drew has been with the organization for 14 years. He designs and leads strategies to reduce public health impacts from toxic chemicals. Drew, so for anyone attending a Pure Earth briefing for the first time, do tell us about Pure Earth.
Hi, Leslie. Lovely
Hi.
to be with you. Pure Earth is a nonprofit organization. We were founded in 1999, so we're on our 24th year, and we're headquartered in New York, but our focus is almost exclusively on low-income and middle-income countries and trying to avoid exposure to toxic chemicals among the residents of those countries. So we're a global organization. In addition to a headquarters in New York, we've got 8 offices around the world in low or middle income countries. And that includes Latin America, Africa, East Europe, South Asia, Southeast Asia. So spanning the whole globe. And then, for many years, we addressed all sorts of toxic chemicals. But in recent years, we've been focusing down to those issues that cause, in our opinion, the greatest human health impacts, and those issues where we think we have the most expertise and can really add the most value and have the most impact. And it turns out for our organization, that means addressing lead exposure and mercury exposure in particular. So that has been our focus.
So how and why did you do that? I mean, by that, I mean, shift the focus from, previously all kinds of toxic chemical waste cleanup to lead and mercury.
Yeah, so in recent years, our understanding of the relative contribution to diseases and death from different chemicals has really improved. there are kind of new analyses out there that can estimate the total disease burden that something like lead causes versus something like arsenic or cadmium or abandoned pesticides, all of these different chemicals, which are all serious challenges in the world and they all deserve attention. But based on those analyses, we have decided for ourselves that we think that addressing lead and mercury has the largest upside in terms of public health. So that's really been our focus. These are also really solvable problems. There aren't a huge number of sources of exposure to these things. And so it's a really tractable problem, we feel.
Okay. Now, I understand you're in the midst of some truly novel research, that you're sending investigators to markets in 25 low and middle income countries, and they're buying and testing common household products, and they're testing for lead. So tell us what you're finding.
Yeah, so anyone that gets involved in heavy metal work or toxic contamination work, particularly around lead and mercury, will pretty soon ask themselves and start wondering, what are the sources of exposure that are really driving poisoning the most? So in the US, for example, I think most people are familiar with paint and pipes as exposure sources for lead. But indeed, there are actually lots of different exposure sources, and those exposure sources change from place to place. So we are trying to help the world answer this big question, particularly for lead. What are the exposure sources that cause poisoning? And one of the tools that we're using to try to help answer that question is what we call the rapid market screening program. So as you mentioned, yes, we're in 25 countries. We're buying thousands and thousands of consumer products and foods and spices, cookware, all sorts of different items, and then testing their lead content to try to approximate what is really driving exposures in all of these different geographies. And one of the challenges, it changes tremendously from place to place. So we have paint and pipes in the United States, but we also have spices. Mostly those spices originate overseas. And in a globalized economy with globalized supply chains, you can't distinguish what is causing poisoning in one place versus another, because there's an interplay between all countries in the world now. So we're halfway through this project, actually probably 75% of the way through now, and we have found some really interesting results. Should I share those now?
That would be great.
Yeah, so I just want people to keep in mind that these are preliminary, but we're finding things, for example, like contaminated spices. In Central Asia, for example, we have found that about 40% of the spice samples that we've tested have really high levels of lead in them. So those are your countries like Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, all of the Stan countries in Central Asia, really, really high levels of lead in spices. But then also equally concerning, we're finding lead in cookware in every country that we've tested. So this could be ceramic cooking pots or food serving dishes, but also kind of inexpensive aluminum cookware. In fact, for both of those things, both ceramics and aluminum cookware, globally, we've found that about 45% of all the samples we tested had elevated levels of lead in them. So quite a concerning global issue there. And then additionally, we're finding lead in things like cosmetics and herbal medicines, plastics and toys. And for all of these things, we're finding lead in, elevated levels of lead in more than 5 or 10% of the samples that we are testing globally.
Okay. Well, that certainly sounds quite concerning. Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Drew. Let me remind anyone who's listening, who's part of our audience, to drop your questions for our speakers in the Q&A. Next up, we have Dr. Paramita Hore, who directs environmental exposure assessment and education for the New York City Department of Health. And basically, Paramita oversees investigations of hazardous consumer products that contain lead as part of the Bureau of Environmental Disease and Injury Prevention at the NYC Department of Health. She's been with the department for almost 20 years, and she's a frequent collaborator with Pure Earth. Paramita, could you give us a little background on how the New York City Health Department finds out about hazardous consumer products?
Sure. First, a hello to you and everyone here today.
Hello.
So at the New York City Health Department, to give you a background, we get the blood lead levels of every New York City resident, and that includes children as well as adults, pregnant as well as non-pregnant adults, as part of routine blood lead surveillance activity. And we conduct follow-up investigations for individuals with an elevated blood lead level. And part of these investigations entail, we conduct interviews, ask questions about potential lead risk factors, and as informed by the interviews, we can conduct environmental sampling, including testing of quote unquote suspect products that we may feel may be the lead source for the individual. And this information is routinely tracked. And so based on our surveillance data, what we have learned is that certain traditional consumer products can contain really high levels of lead and have been associated with elevated blood lead levels. We also know or have seen through our data is that lead-containing consumer products are the second most common potential source of lead exposure for New York City children. And further, among our New York City pregnant cases, imported products are the most common potential lead source identified. So what amongst basically all of our data, what we see are New York City's immigrant communities are at an increased risk for lead exposures to these types of products.
Thank you. I'm curious to know, what an extremely common consumer product is that that might contain lead that people aren't aware about.
I think I can say we've seen a variety of different consumer products from around the world with elevated levels. Drew mentioned spices, Drew mentioned ceramic ware. We've seen high levels of lead in consumer products such as traditional health remedies, cultural powders, traditional metalware or ceramic ware from Mexico, Hygiene from Morocco. It varies.
Thank you. Okay, so it's through the various investigations that you just described that you began to see a pattern with families from Georgia, correct? And we're not talking about the state, we're talking about the country. So tell us about how that unfolded and how you worked with Pure Earth.
Absolutely, yes, that is true. And based on this ongoing monitoring of New York City lead poisoning cases, as I described, we identified that New York City children with Georgian ancestry were at an increased risk for elevated blood lead levels. And through our product surveillance activity, we also realized that Georgia was one of the countries where cases were obtaining spices from that were found to contain extremely high levels of lead. And these included spices such as Georgian saffron, spice mixtures such as camelli sinelli, carcho sinelli. So what we took some actions around this, right? Our goal is to kind of share our findings so that it can impact change and ultimately change the source. So between 2011 and 2017, we shared our findings with Georgian authorities in Georgia with the help of our New York City consulate, Georgia. We also published these findings in a paper called Spoonful of Lead. You can certainly read more details there. And we've shared our findings with partners such as Pure Earth, who have a foot in the door in these countries, right? So informed by these findings, Georgia engaged in activities that, and I'm gonna maybe tap you, Drew, to describe some of the activities that the Georgian government took.
Sure, hi, Paramita. I just think this anecdote about Georgia is one of the most interesting stories I've seen about the interconnected nature of our world and the feedback loops that can exist. So as you laid out, Paramita, New York City did this excellent ongoing investigation, identified Georgian spices as a problem. Then the government of Georgia worked with UNICEF to start testing kids' blood in 2019, and they tested thousands of Georgian kids' blood in Georgia and realized that about 41% of the Georgian children had lead poisoning in Georgia. At that point, they were quite concerned. They reached out to us and said, could you help us identify what it is that's poisoning kids here? So we went over and did an assessment in the homes of lead-poisoned kids in Georgia, and we identified that indeed contaminated spices appeared to be a major driver of exposure. So UNICEF, Pure Earth, the government of Georgia, and other local actors all contributed different elements to a really robust program there to test hundreds and hundreds of spice samples across the country, to work with producers to make sure they understand the law, to make sure they understand what's causing the risk in their production processes, and then conducted a public education campaign. The government, of course, was very active in enforcing their existing laws. They have had laws on the books preventing people from adding these, it's really industrial pigments that people are adding to spices that bring in these heavy metals. So a really robust enforcement effort and education effort. And so then kind of we left the scenario by testing spices at the end of this program to make sure, and indeed the levels of lead in spices went dramatically down, nearly 100 times lower than just a couple of years earlier. But I was delighted to hear from Paramita recently that they are now seeing apparently results in New York City, kind of completing this circle of feedback. Paramita, do you want to pick it up from there?
Sure. No, thank you. Absolutely. I think remedial actions being taken in Georgia are definitely showing trends of a global impact, right? We're seeing a decline in the number of New York City children with elevated blood lead levels that have Georgian ancestry. And we're also seeing a decline in the percentage of spice samples from Georgia with detectable lead. So we'll continue to monitor through our routine surveillance activities, but it certainly is exciting to hear.
Well, thank you both for that comprehensive description and explanation. So the next question, I think I might have already asked you, so let's go through it briefly. Beyond spices, Paramita, what other types of consumer products or sources result in lead poisoning cases in New York City? And Drew, if you would like to speak up to how this lines up. Paramita first and then Drew.
Sure. Yeah, as mentioned, we've seen high levels of lead in certain types of traditional health remedies, some of which have included a specific type of Ayurvedic medications, which are the Rasa Shastra Ayurvedic medications. We recently published on that, so there's definitely more information there. We've seen it in cultural powders, as well as traditional metalware and ceramic ware from Mexico, or tagines from Morocco's, etc. But what we generally see are products found to contain these types of extremely high levels of lead are typically made abroad in low and middle income countries and often hand carried by the individuals into New York City during travel. So although we routinely conduct education outreach to raise awareness amongst the communities to these lead risk factors, we realize really the ultimate and effective source or solution is fixing the problem at the countries of origin. And that's why this sort of partnership with Pure Earth is very exciting. I'll turn it over to you, Drew.
Oh, I couldn't have said it better myself, Paramita. Our message is the same. This is not something that we can solve strictly within our borders. We live in a world where products just traverse borders every day. So this is a global problem. It needs global solutions.
Okay. Paramita, we in the US, like to pride ourselves in our regulatory regimes meant to protect consumers, but are these types of lead-containing consumer products an issue elsewhere in the United States?
This certainly is not just a New York City issue. We've had dialogue and received reports from other US jurisdictions that also have found elevated blood lead levels associated with lead-containing consumer products. What needs to happen is we need to get a better sense of how big this issue is nationally in the United States. So one of our recommendations is to create a national repository of product-related lead surveillance data that can be collected by different jurisdictions around the country during lead poisoning case investigations. Until we illustrate the significance of this issue nationally, we're if we better can illustrate this issue nationally, we can inform intervention strategies abroad at the countries of origin.
Thank you so much, Paramita. I have to say that as a New York City resident, as a mom, I appreciate your efforts. Next
Thank you.
up, we have, you're welcome. Next up, we have Dr. Jim Rogers with Consumer Reports. Jim is the Director of Food Safety Research and Testing at Consumer Reports. He's responsible for leading food safety and sustainability operations of the organization, which includes food testing, data analysis, and risk and safety assessments. Jim and his team have put out a series of reports in the last few years documenting heavy metal contamination in baby food, fruit juices, spices, and most recently, dark chocolate. These have been widely covered. So let's start with a brief update for our audience on the baby food issue. Jim, your organization and many others have conducted investigations documenting heavy metal content in baby food. How had baby food companies and U.S. regulators responded?
Good morning, Leslie.
Good morning.
So we did this testing back in 2016, 2017. It was published on our website and in our magazine. And as always, we share our results sometimes before publication with regulatory agencies and with the baby food companies themselves. We will share their specific data on their products that we tested. Some of the manufacturers agreed with our calls for mandatory federal limits on these heavy metals. They acknowledged that this is a difficult problem to address sometimes because heavy metals will be in the soil and be taken up by the plants, et cetera, that are eventually used for baby food. And so they are called naturally occurring. Now, we also know that it can be also tied to pollution. And so when we suggested, well, maybe you can source ingredients for your baby food that test lower for heavy metals and test from the beginning, which is ingredient acquisition, to the end, which is when you're sending your baby food out to consumers, maybe you can figure out whether it's ingredients, it's the manufacturing process, et cetera, and do something about it. We would really love for them to do, before they ship it out, in-product testing so that we do not let these products go out to babies and be fed to babies. And to remind people that organic is not safer. Now, regarding our regulatory agencies, that's a bit of a disappointment, but we have made a bit of progress. You may be aware that back in 2021, a program called Closer to Zero was implemented or suggested by the Food and Drug Administration with the goal of reducing these heavy metal in baby foods down to the lowest amount possible. Now, Closer to Zero started in 2021, but we just received in January of this year their draft guidance for lead in baby foods. Now, that's kind of late, took a little while, and that was a little bit of a disappointment, but at least they proposed something, to propose a 10 part per billion amount of lead in the various baby foods, such as juices, meats, vegetables, etc. This was only draft guidance. They were taking comments in March, but we've heard nothing else about any of the other heavy metals. For instance, draft guidance for mercury was due in January also, but we have not seen anything like that. So a little disappointed by the federal regulatory agencies, but at least they're doing something, and they're responding to testing from organizations such as ours, other consumer organizations, but also pressure from our members of Congress that something needs to be done about this issue.
Thank you for that. Well, tell us, what kind of progress is being made to identify and implement these solutions?
Well, I mentioned one that we believe in testing. So we believe that these manufacturers should really see where is this contamination being introduced along the line. Now, sadly, we won't be able to see their results. They don't share that. That's business sensitive information, but we at least want them to know what's going on and what changes that they could implement. Maybe it requires new manufacturing equipment for baby food that does not intentionally introduce heavy metals during the manufacturing process. But also, if you look at our articles, our website, we also tell the consumer for each of these issues, what can you do as a consumer? The first thing is become an informed consumer. Look at our research, look at other research, and find out what the data is saying about possible heavy metal contamination in baby food. Also, use that information when you go shopping. We do know that manufacturers respond to economic pressure, and if you do not buy their products and tie that to some type of communication directly to the manufacturer, they will respond because it's in their economic interest to offer safer food that you're willing to buy as a parent. We also always offer links in our articles on how to advocate for yourself and for your baby. So we are constantly assembling signatures for petitions to the federal government, to these manufacturers, to make baby food safer. And so this is a way for the consumer to get engaged and to advocate on their own behalf, advocate to Congress. They can do this on their own too. They can write letter to their local Congress people and ask to please do something about this important issue.
That's great advice. So I want to ask you about something of great personal interest to me, dark chocolate. You published new research on this subject in December, and the title was "Lead and Cadmium Could Be in Your Dark Chocolate. Consumer Reports Found Dangerous Heavy Metals in Chocolate from Popular Brands." So give us an overview of these findings.
Well, Leslie, this was a continuation of testing that I've participated in since I've been with Consumer Reports about 6.5 years ago. As you mentioned, we have tested spices, bottled water, tap water, and then we chose dark chocolate back to publish in December for a number of reasons. On the one hand, dark chocolate, and I'm an avid eater of dark chocolate too, has a health halo around it. Dark chocolate with the higher amounts of cacao are associated with an increased amounts of flavonoids, antioxidants, anti-inflammatory ingredients that are actually supposed to be good for you. However, research has shown that there could be some issues with dark chocolate being contaminated by heavy metals, more specifically the heavy metals cadmium, which can be found in the soil where the chocolate trees grow, or lead, which is introduced during processing or can be introduced during processing. So what we did is we went to retail and we purchased 28 different bars of dark chocolate. Would have loved to do milk chocolate too, but we did not have the resources at the time. And we did find concerning levels of cadmium or lead, which are two toxic heavy metals, in most of them. Actually, every bar that we tested had detectable levels of cadmium and lead, but we also found what we termed concerning, which were higher. And what that means to us is that in brands such as Theo's or Hershey's or Trader Joe's, that if you ate just 1 ounce of this chocolate a day, that would take you over what are considered health limits for those two heavy metals. And consumers also need to be aware that we're talking about one item in their diet. We're not talking about the entire source via their diet that could possibly have heavy metal contamination. And so what we found is that of 23 of those 28 bars had concerning levels, but there were 5 bars that we found that had less and that we termed safer. Now, remember, we didn't say safe, we didn't say zero, we said safer, because we do realize that consumers will continue to eat dark chocolate. And so we wanted to give them some options, at least within this environment that we tested. But we also recommended, do not feed this to your children, because if there is heavy metals in there, it could affect their development. And especially pregnant women, not to eat dark chocolate, because we did not want them to expose their fetuses to these potentially dangerous heavy metals.
Right. I'm curious what response you got from the producers, the retailers, and from regulators.
Well, you know that most of these producers kind of already know that there's a potential issue and may not have figured out how to address it. Most of the producers agreed with us that when we made recommendations, they should source their cacao or their chocolate ingredients from known suppliers via testing that they have low heavy metals in their cacao, they agreed with us. They also agreed with us about trying to find soils to plant new chocolate trees so that we know that younger trees take up less cadmium, and so potentially would produce chocolate that had less cadmium. The problem is, though, a lot of times they will source their chocolate from poor growers. And if they stopped purchasing the cacao, the chocolate beans from these growers, it could potentially cause economic hardship. So there was a slight reluctance there. But they are aware, they do agree, again, like that we suggested before, stem to stern, beginning to end testing to find out where they could lower the amount of cadmium, make sure their suppliers are supplying low heavy metal contaminated ingredients. And so pretty much they agreed with us. It's just getting them to actually do it and trying to figure out solutions that cause the least amount of harm across the board during the manufacturing process. With lead, it's a little different because lead usually comes during the processing of the beans where they dry them outside. Sometimes the lead contaminated soil can blow onto the beans. So can you move where you process the chocolate beans? Can you cover them up? Can you develop ways of washing these beans so you can wash the lead away? So, and pretty much they're pretty in alignment with us. It's just getting them to do it and showing us evidence through testing that actually the situation has gotten better.
Right. And you said you didn't hear much from the FDA.
Yeah, that's the thing. What we found is with this and with other issues that we bring to the federal government, as I said, they work at a glacial pace. I used to work for the USDA, so I'm very familiar with the regulatory process. So we didn't hear much from them. What we are finding, though, is that there are many states that are very, very receptive to changing their state regulations as to how much what levels they're willing to allow into their state. And so California, for instance, is a very hospitable state for consumer advocacy and getting their regulations to a point where these chocolate or baby food products are not allowed to be sold if they have high amounts of heavy metals. And so what I've heard the term creating a net of chaos, where you have so many states in the United States that are preventing these products being sold in their state that eventually, with a gentle, loving nudge, we're getting the manufacturers to realize this isn't acceptable for us and we need you to change it. So where the federal's agencies may not be doing much, it seems like that at times we can get much more traction with states to make changes in their state laws.
Okay, so at least there's that path.
Yes,
I
and
know
we do
that
both. We do
Right,
both. We advocate for
right.
the FDA, we advocate with the states. So.
Right. Okay. I know that you included some findings from the group As You Sow about how lead and cadmium gets into chocolate starting at the source. Was there anything in particular you wanted to call out there before we move on?
Well, I think that in the article, we did talk about the work that As We Sow was doing, and that our findings and our advocacy were really in line with what they had advocated for and what some of their findings for. So it's yet another consumer group is in alignment with consumer reports as to what should be done about this important problem with chocolate, not just dark chocolate, but all chocolate.
Great. Okay, thank you so much. I encourage you all to look at these reports, and I also encourage you to drop your questions into the Q&A, and we'll try to get to them. Okay, thank you, Jim. Our final speaker is Dr. Stefan Boaz-O'Reilly, who wears several hats. He's a pediatrician, he's Pure Earth's Senior Technical Director, and he's also a professor of environmental and public health at LMU Munich. Welcome, Stefan. Stefan, this is a lot of concerning information. So help us make sense of this. You're a pediatrician, a public health practitioner. How much risk is posed by consuming these products? What health impacts should we need to worry about?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for all the information so far. I must admit, I don't live in the US. I live in Germany. We have a kind of a bit different, regulations on consumer protection. So forgive me that my background might not be absolutely suitable for all of you. As a pediatrician, chocolate is a tricky issue. I will not say much about chocolate because as pediatricians, we're not so much in favor for kids eating chocolate anyway for other purposes. But the baby food issue, I really take very serious as a pediatrician. And you were discussing, and I find it excellent that you have analyzed all the baby food products and informed the consumers and pushed the agencies to become active. But different to pesticides, for example, which are man-made, toxic metals, heavy metals like lead or mercury or cadmium, arsenic, they're natural elements of the Earth's crust. So whatever we produce, and James said that clearly as well, whether it's organic or not, it will always contain a certain amount of lead, mercury, cadmium, and arsenic. So getting close to zero is possible, but getting to zero is impossible. And so the risk estimation is to get as low as possible. And it's exactly what you were saying. You have to control the products coming in, for example, the rice, before being manufactured, and then the final product in the jar, for example, how much arsenic is in that product. That's exactly what we need. And we need levels where kids are safe. Safe from what? The levels which were reported are levels where you can observe what we medical doctors call subclinical levels. Subclinical is something you cannot observe directly on your body. The clinical effect is a symptom that you can observe. Subclinical is, for example, that the kids perform not as good on cognitive tests as others. So for sure, we want to reduce the amount of toxic metals in baby food, but we do not intoxicate the kids with these kind of baby foods and reported levels. What is concerning most, and I was really surprised about to see the results, is arsenic in rice. And these are the highest levels, especially if I compare them to the existing threshold levels in the European Union. So rice and arsenic is a specific topic, but as well, there was one sample where the lead level was too high. And what can you do to avoid as a consumer? Yeah, for sure, hope that the agencies really protect the kids. That's very important. That's the pressure consumers have. Make sure that the companies are forced to reduce the amount of toxic metals in their products by informing the consumers about companies which are more restrictive or not. And then from tomorrow on, just use a mixed diet. You know, my kids always like the same jar as well. So I usually got in the supermarket, got all the 10 of them. But a mixed diet seems to be safer, just to avoid, because you don't have toxic metals in all, you have in some products. But we should take into consideration that we are on a relatively safe side of the world. And there are other children in this world, we just get new results in, for example, from India. And in India, the kids have 10 to 50 times higher levels of lead in their blood compared to our kids in Europe or the US. And there's a reason for it. And one of the reasons Drew started to mention this is, for example, the issue of spices. So these kids are really exposed to what was reported there, 100, 1,000 or 10 times higher levels of contamination in their food. So we should take into consideration as well, and that is what Pure Earth is standing for as well, the mission to reduce these exposure levels for kids globally and to help those kids to have a safe life as well and to be protected as well. Thank you, Leslie.
Well, thank you so much for that, Stefan. Now it's time to take the questions that have been coming in. We have, excuse me for one moment. Okay, this is a question from Tim Pye. Drew, how high in parts per million is are spices? Or the contamination in spices? Drew, I'll let you take that.
Sure. So the first thing to note is that for lead, for example, there is no safe level of lead in the human body. The body has no use for lead. It's not supposed to be there. And it starts damaging the body and the mind at the lowest concentrations that we've studied. However, as Stefan pointed out, it's impossible to totally remove these metals from food because they exist naturally in the world and in the Earth's crust. So we set, different governments set different regulatory thresholds or public health guidances for the concentration of lead that will be allowed in different jurisdictions. For our research, we set a level of 2 parts per million of lead in spices to classify what we call an elevated level of lead. And this is, different, as I mentioned, different jurisdictions have set different levels. I think in the US, food additives, the level is 1 part per million, I believe. We borrowed this threshold from the European Union. They classified different types of spices at different threshold levels, and 2 parts per million was the highest one they used. So for our global research, we've kind of grabbed this standard. But the point is, 1 or 2 parts per million for spices is kind of a common public health recommendation or regulatory threshold. But I'd be curious to also, if Paramita and James are familiar with different thresholds that are used in public health agencies or different countries.
I'll quickly comment. I agree with Drew, what Drew said. It varies across the globe. And one thing that we also take into consideration are the interim reference levels that FDA has, which is the body burden of lead through ingestion. So whether you're using 2 ppm or 1 ppm or 5 ppm or 10, you can estimate amount of lead you may be ingesting based on the amount of, say, spice one may be ingesting. So I don't know if anyone else wants to comment.
Yeah, real quick, Drew, I do agree with you. I think that what you see when you look at federal regulatory, either interim guidance or regulatory law, is that the amounts are all over the place. We always advocate for as low as possible. We've also said there's no safe levels of lead, but so far from what I've seen, there's not a baseline across all federal regulatory agencies, such as the EPA that regulates water, the FDA that regulates some food, et cetera, for a safe level. I think they take into consideration the matrix, but they also take into consideration whether it is even achievable with that particular product, given the systems that we have right now. So.
Okay. So the next question is from Sharon. If in the Consumer Reports report regarding heavy metals in baby foods, is there a distinction made between the sources, naturally occurring heavy metals versus heavy metals introduced during the manufacturing process?
Yes, Sharon. What we look at is, or what we also advocate for is, if you look at the ingredients that are going to end up in the baby food, before the raw ingredients, before any processing is happening, there could be a certain level of heavy metals there. We also look at during the manufacturing process, because of all the machinery and metal, plastics, et cetera, are there any heavy metals introduced during the manufacturing process also? So that in your end product, you may, in a terrible situation, have heavy metals introduced both from the ingredients, but also the manufacturing process. Again, I think I mentioned this, but it's hard to figure out which one it is, since we can't get into the plants and take different tests or test the machinery or whatever ourselves. But we see it as 2 different problems that have 2 different solutions that the manufacturers really should be addressing.
Okay, and just for the non-scientists among us, Stefan, could I just ask you to explain the difference and significance between parts per thousand, parts per million, parts per billion? And I have a second question, which I'll just shove in there. What studies make you believe lead levels are lower in children in Europe? Stefan.
Okay, it's difficult to explain. You have about, I think, 350 million people in US, don't you?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah. So you don't reach a billion like the Chinese. So a part per billion would be possible in China. 1 person in China, 1.4 person in China would be 1 part per billion. And 1 in a million, you have 300 people in US. So this is really, it's 1,000 times different. The factor is 1,000 in between. And we usually use, like Drew was mentioning, 1 part per million for spices, ppm. And we have to be careful not to be confused because the results from James were parts per billion. And this, we were not able to analyze these things in the recent years because the labs couldn't analyze this. To find 1 person in China who's doing something wrong is very difficult. You know, that's 1 part per billion. So we always have to look really, are we looking for parts per million or parts per billion? And just because we see a number, it doesn't mean it's the same, because we know that to see an effect, we need a certain amount of toxic material, so toxic exposure. And this is why I was saying with identifying parts per billion, it's not good. As Drew was saying, there's no safe level. But this is different to what we did find years ago was parts per million. That's why I'm a bit careful about this. Then about the second question, the European Union has a big human biomonitoring project called HBM, Human Biomonitoring for EU. And there is a dashboard. And under this dashboard, you can find all the different studies in Europe and even by time. And so you see the reduction over time in lead levels. And we just had last week a presentation from the German EPA, just giving the results from the last survey of the kids in Germany. And the kids in Germany, 95% of those kids have lead levels below 1 microgram per deciliter. And the US CDC recommendation is 3.5. WHO recommendation is 5 microgram per deciliter. So we really low down now. And this was not the first wave, you know, they come in waves, these environmental epidemiological studies, and they really have a nice trend to lower levels. Doesn't mean it's absolutely healthy, but at least the kids are decade by decade better protected from lead. This is the positive thing, but it's only possible because, like you have in New York City, or you have with enhanced in US studies which give these levels. And this is exactly what's missing in low and middle income countries. They don't have these kind of studies. They don't see these trends. Vice versa, they see even lead levels going up. This, I think, is okay as an answer. Thank you, Leslie.
Great. Okay. We have a question from Ravshan, who wants to ask about the transboundary movement of types of lead, how lead travels from one country to another, and does Pure Earth have a plan to study this problem?
That one sounds like it might be for me. I actually just typed an answer to Ravshan in seconds ago, but
Okay.
I'll also deliver it here. Basically, yes, this is an area of intense interest for us. And I think the most illuminating product that we will deliver to the world this year will be a final report from this market screening program I talked about at the beginning of the hour, where we're going to test approximately 7,000 consumer items, foods and products from 25 countries, and share all of the concentrations that we've found from these thousands and thousands of items. And people will recognize that these are items that are shipped and consumed globally. So even though these results are from 25 countries, they really show a common risk across people in all countries, because these end up, just as Georgian spices did not stay in Georgia, they ended up in New York City. The same is true of most of the types of products that we're studying. So look out later this year for a final report from Pure Earth on this.
Okay. Carty mentioned, had a question. James mentioned 23 out of 28 samples tested positive for lead. What were the 5 brands that were lead safe? I'm only mentioning this because James responded that she looked at cr.org for the dark chocolate study, which has all the data and the recommendations. So here's a question from Maxwell, who is from Ghana. African governments appear disinterested in heavy metal contamination. How do we stimulate the interest of policymakers of these countries concerning heavy metal? And I will ask you first, Drew.
Sure. I think, there are a couple of levers that the public can pull to increase government interest. Fortunately, we have seen some really nice activity among some African governments, really proactive stances, but I think what the public can do is a couple of things. First, they can kind of, rattle the cage a little bit and make some noise, get involved with civil society organizations in country to just let the government know that the public is concerned about these issues, and raise alarm bells. It's things like public education campaigns that people like Paramita and James are running in the US that let the public know there's a risk, and then the public can respond with their own voice and tell their representatives, hey, I care about this. I'm concerned as a parent. I'm concerned for my own well-being. So I think public activism is important. And then the other thing that we've seen drive government interest is data. A government that when levels of toxins in the human body become public information, when there's good data on what a population is experiencing, then a government can't really hide from that issue anymore. So we're big advocates of not only research, but the transparency of research and data, so that everyone is on an equal footing in terms of knowing the risks, and then governments are essentially forced to respond.
Okay, anyone else want to weigh in on that question before I move on to the next one? Okay, Stefan.
Yeah. The question is excellent. Why so? The funding of a government, the money it has, needs to be spent appropriately. And for this, data is needed. And the data is not existing for most countries, including Ghana on lead, for example. We're just working on this as Pure at the moment, but in general, they're not existing. There is a positive example. It's on mercury, which is a toxic element as well. And there's the Minamata Convention on Mercury. This is a United Nations convention, especially on mercury. And it requests from the countries, including Ghana, a national action plan. And so they have to make an inventory of the sources, for example, for mercury, and come up with an action plan how to reduce this. And other countries, for example, Switzerland or Germany or Norway, are paying into this Minamata Convention to enable those countries which don't have the financial possibilities to start to work on this issue. And finally, it's as well a capacity issue. And capacity is human capacity, for example. It's what you teach at the university. So, for example, what our topics are School of Public Health, what lab capacities exist, and this is, a kind of developmental aid as well in increasing these capacities. So it's not so easy just to blame the government that it doesn't become active. It's a bit more complex, and it's not black and not white. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much, Stefan. Just one final comment here. We have an expression in support of the Minamata Convention on mercury from Dada in Nigeria in the comments. Okay, so thank you very much to all our panelists and to all of you for listening. I'm going to turn this over to Angela now, and I appreciate your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie, for moderating. Thanks to all our speakers and all the great questions. We'll be sending out a recording of the webinar so you can share it with any colleagues, anyone in your network who may be interested. And if there are any questions that you wanted to answer or you think about later, please email me directly at angela@pureearth.org, and I will coordinate and get the answer out to you. And please follow us on social. Our handle is @pureearthnow. Liking and sharing our posts and spreading the word really, really helps. And enjoy the Earth Day weekend in your communities. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.